You may have recently observed the sensationalized headlines flickering across your digital screens, framing this latest geopolitical development as merely another clash of individual personalities, a high-stakes wrestling match between a former central banking official and a populist president. The corporate media apparatus is enamored with this specific narrative frame because it is deceptively simple, inherently dramatic, and slots seamlessly into the relentless 24-hour news cycle that relies upon conflict for its survival. Their objective is to persuade you to accept the notion that the events transpiring within the potash market are simply a matter of Mark Carney intellectually outmaneuvering Donald Trump, or one political faction scoring a tactical point against its opposition. However, if you cease your inquiry at that superficial level, if you allow them to convince you that this scenario is exclusively about two powerful men brandishing their egos, you are overlooking the significantly more consequential and perilous narrative that is currently unfolding directly beneath your 12 feet. I invite you to retreat a step with me today. We must examine what is fundamentally occurring here, for this is emphatically not a saga concerning individuals. Rather, this is a profound narrative concerning the structural realities of global capitalism, the critical issue of food security, and the ultimate question of who possesses dominion over the resources that sustain the lives of you and your family. When we engage in discourse regarding potash, we are not discussing some obscure commodity that is of interest solely to day traders. We are speaking of fertilizer. We are discussing the foundational input that enables modern agricultural systems to function. Absent potash, crop yields plummet. Without this mineral, food prices escalate dramatically, and the fragile equilibrium of the global food supply disintegrates. Therefore, when you witness a development such as this, a bold, strategic maneuver within the potash market that effectively blindsides the American political establishment, you must comprehend that this is not a game. This constitutes a battle for control over the most elemental necessities of human existence. Furthermore, the resolution of this conflict is destined to impact your grocery expenditures, your regional economy, and the stability of the world you inhabit far more profoundly than any social media post or campaign rally ever could. We must excavate the truth of what actually transpired here, looking beyond the sensationalist text scrolling at the bottom of the news channel. The narrative you are being fed suggests that Carney, representing a specific faction of global finance and perhaps Canadian strategic interests, has executed a play that effectively checkmates the protectionist bluster we have come to anticipate from the Trump camp. Superficially, it appears to be a clever financial gambit, a method to secure market share or leverage prices in a manner that benefits one side of the border while leaving the other side scrambling. However, we must ask, what is the economic logic driving this, and why is this occurring now? Furthermore, why is the United States, typically the heavyweight contender in these negotiations, suddenly appearing so vulnerable? To comprehend this, you must first understand the intrinsic nature of the potash industry itself. It is what economists classify as an oligopoly, a minuscule cluster of colossal corporations that command the vast majority of the planet's supply. This is not a free market in the theoretical sense that Adam Smith envisioned, featuring thousands of modest producers competing to sell you fertilizer at the lowest possible cost. Instead, this is a cartelized system wherein production is strictly disciplined, prices are meticulously managed, and geopolitical power is intrinsically embedded into every single ton of product that is extracted from the mine. Canada sits atop massive reserves, just as Russia and Belarus sit atop massive reserves. The United States, while a producer itself, remains heavily reliant on imports to sustain its massive industrial agriculture sector. What Carney's strategic move exposes is the fragility of that reliance. By maneuvering within this market, perhaps by consolidating control or shifting export strategies, he has found a way to bypass American leverage. The signal currently being transmitted is that the era of unquestioned American economic hegemony, even over its closest neighbors, is colliding with the hard wall of resource reality. You see, for decades, the prevailing assumption has been that the United States possesses the authority to dictate the terms of trade. If they desire a tariff, they impose it. If they desire a superior deal, they demand it. However, what we are witnessing here is the counter-movement of capital. Capital, particularly resource capital and finance capital, does not pledge allegiance to a flag in the manner that you or I do. It seeks return, it seeks stability, and if the political leadership in the United States becomes too volatile, too unpredictable with its tariffs and its trade wars, capital will inevitably discover a method to protect itself. That is precisely what Carney represents within this equation. He is not merely functioning as a politician or a banker. He stands as a symbol of that technocratic management style of global capitalism which prioritizes stability above all other considerations. His strategic action within the potash market serves effectively as a method of insulating the profits of these fertilizer giants from the political turbulence emanating from Washington. However, there is a critical caveat, and this is the point where you must pay close attention. While these titans clash above our heads, while Carney outmaneuvers Trump and Trump rages against the maneuver, we must ask, who is actually paying the price for this volatility? It is the farmer in Iowa who remains uncertain if he can afford to plant for the next season. It is the laborer in the fertilizer plant who does not know if his employment is secure. Ultimately, it is you, walking down the aisle of your supermarket, wondering why a loaf of bread or a bag of vegetables costs 20% more than it did 6 months ago. The system is functioning exactly as it is designed to work for them, protecting their assets and their leverage while passing the risk and the cost down to you. We must be incredibly precise regarding the mechanism at play here. When we state that someone has cornered a market or executed a bold move in a commodity sector, we are usually discussing restriction. We are discussing the management of supply to maintain price. In a rational economic system, one organized around human needs, the objective of potash production would be to distribute as much fertilizer as possible to as many farmers as possible, to grow as much food as possible at the lowest possible cost. That would constitute the logical, humane method of organizing affairs, but under capitalism, that is not the goal. The goal is profit. If restricting supply raises prices and increases profit, they will unhesitatingly restrict supply. If shifting exports to a different market yields a superior return compared to selling to the U.S., they will shift those exports. Carney's strategy, regardless of the specific financial instruments utilized, is deeply rooted in this logic. It is about leveraging Canada's dominant position in this specific resource to gain political and economic leverage. It serves as a stark reminder that real power in the global economy is not solely determined by who sits in the Oval Office. It is determined by who controls the physical materials upon which the economy runs. Right now, the United States is awakening to the uncomfortable reality that it does not hold all the cards. This potash maneuver acts as a microcosm of a much larger shift. It is a shift wherein resource-rich nations and the financial architects who manage their wealth are beginning to push back against the demand-side power of the American consumer market. Consider what this implies for the structure of the North American economy. We are constantly told that we are partners, that we possess free trade, and that the borders are open for business. Yet, the moment the profit motive is threatened, or the moment a political opportunity arises to squeeze the other side, those partnerships evaporate. The bold move we are analyzing is essentially a weaponization of trade interdependence. It is a declaration stating, you need what we have, and if you are going to make life difficult for us with your policies, we are going to make you pay for it at the source. Because the potash market is so concentrated, because there are so few alternatives, the U.S. possesses very little room to maneuver. This illustrates the danger of allowing critical industries to be operated for profit rather than as public utilities. If potash were treated as a public good, managed cooperatively for the benefit of the people in both countries, this kind of high-stakes poker game would not be possible. However, because it is privatized and financialized, it becomes a chip in a geopolitical casino, and you, the viewer, are not invited to the table. You are merely the one funding the pot. As we peel back the layers of this story, I want you to keep one question at the forefront of your mind. How does a system that allows a few individuals to play chess with the global food supply justify itself? We are told that the market is efficient, and we are told that these financial experts know what they are doing. But if their maneuvering leads to instability, to higher prices, and to trade wars that benefit no one but the speculators, then what exactly is efficient about it? Carney's victory here, if we wish to call it that, is not a victory for the Canadian worker or the American worker. It is a victory for a specific strategy of capital accumulation. It is a demonstration that the financial elite still possess tools to discipline the political elite. even a political elite as loud and aggressive as Donald Trump. But in that clash, the democratic will of the people, the desire for stable prices, for good jobs, and for a rational economy, is completely ignored. We are spectators at a gladiator match where the admission fee is our own economic security. That is why we must analyze this not just as a news story, but as a symptom of a systemic disease. We need to examine the history of how we arrived at this point. We must explore how potash became a strategic weapon and why our leaders are willing to gamble with it. This is not something that occurred overnight. It is the result of decades of deregulation, corporate consolidation, and the slow erosion of public control over essential resources. To understand the gravity of this situation, you have to peel away the layers of financial jargon and look at the physical reality of the economy. We are not talking about software or intellectual property here. We are talking about potassium. Potash is the K in the NPK rating you see on every bag of fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It is an elemental substance. You cannot print it at the Federal Reserve, nor can you code it into existence in Silicon Valley. You have to dig it out of the ground, and this is where the United States, for all its military and economic might, runs into a geological wall. The U.S. consumes vast amounts of potash to fuel its industrial agriculture, the Corn Belt, the soy fields, the massive monocultures that feed the country and much of the world, but it produces very little of it. Now, direct your attention to the map. Situated just to the north in the province of Saskatchewan lies the region often referred to as the Saudi Arabia of potash. We are discussing immense, ancient seabed deposits that account for nearly half of the entire global trade in this critical mineral. For decades, the arrangement was simple. American farmers needed it. Canadian mines dug it up, and it flowed south across the border in an endless stream of rail cars. It was efficient, it was quiet, and it was profitable for the corporate giants on both sides. But in the eyes of a nationalist administration looking for leverage, that dependency appeared as a target. The threat of tariffs on Canadian fertilizer was supposed to be a cudgel. The logic in the White House was that if you slap a tax on imports, you force the Canadians to lower their prices to stay competitive, or you stimulate domestic production. However, this is the precise juncture where the move is executed and where the economic literacy of the administration was revealed to be fundamentally hollow. One cannot simply stimulate a mine into existence overnight. It requires a decade to bring a new potash shaft into full production. So when the threat was made, the Canadian response, orchestrated with the kind of cool technocratic precision that Carney is famous for, was not to beg for an exemption. It was to simply turn the tap. The message was sent to the global markets. If the United States does not want our potash at the market price, Brazil does, India does, and China does. This is the outsmarting that the headlines are talking about. It was a demonstration of raw supply-side power by signaling a diversification of export contracts and by locking in long-term deals with the rising agricultural powers of the global South. The Canadian strategy effectively squeezed the American supply chain, and suddenly, the U.S. farmer is not just competing with his neighbor for fertilizer, he is competing with a soybean farmer in Mato Grosso who has a guaranteed contract. The tariff, which was meant to punish Canada, essentially transformed into a tax on the American farmer. The price of fertilizer spikes, the cost of production rises, and the very people the administration claimed to be protecting are the ones staring at a balance sheet that no longer makes sense. But we have to look deeper than just a trade dispute. This moment reveals a fundamental shift in the global order that most American policymakers are refusing to accept. For a century, the U.S. economy operated on the assumption that it was the buyer of last resort, that its consumer market was so big and so essential that every other country would bend over backward just to get access to it. That gave the U.S. incredible leverage and the ability to dictate terms, but in a resource-constrained world, the power shifts to the producer. If you have the oil, the lithium, the fresh water, or in this case, the fertilizer, you hold the cards. Carney's maneuver is a recognition of this new reality. He understands that in the 21st century, access to the physical inputs of survival is more valuable than access to the American consumer market. And this is where the class analysis becomes absolutely crucial. Who actually made the decision to play hardball? It was not the miners in Saskatchewan, and it certainly wasn't the farmers in Iowa. It was the executives and the financial managers who run these massive fertilizer conglomerates. For them, this geopolitical tension is an opportunity. When supply is threatened or when trade routes shift, volatility increases. And in the world of finance, volatility is just another word for profit. They can hedge their bets, they can speculate on future prices, and they can use the crisis to justify raising prices far beyond what any tariff would require. We are currently witnessing a classic example of what I term capitalist judo. This involves utilizing the opponent's aggressive energy to overturn them. Trump attacks with a tariff, and global fertilizer capital utilizes that attack to pivot toward more lucrative, rapidly growing markets in the developing world, leaving the American working class, specifically the rural agricultural workforce, to settle the bill. This brings us to the specific mechanics of how this plays out on the ground. When the supply of a critical input like potash is tightened even slightly, the ripple effects are immediate. Local co-ops run out of stock, and prices for future delivery jump 20 or 30%. The small farmer who operates on razor-thin margins is forced to make a terrible choice. Do I plant less? Do I use less fertilizer and risk a lower yield? Or do I take on more debt to pay the inflated prices? This is how the consolidation of agriculture happens. The small players cannot weather the shock. They go under. And who buys their land? The massive corporate agribusinesses that have the capital reserves to ride out the storm. So in a bitter irony, the protectionist policy that was sold as a way to put America first ends up accelerating the destruction of the traditional American family farm. And let's not pretend this was an accident. The people advising Carney and the people running these firms have the best data in the world. They know exactly what the elasticity of demand is. They know exactly how much pain the U.S. market can take before it breaks. This was a calculated risk, a move designed to discipline the U.S. political system by hitting it where it is most vulnerable, the grocery store and the farm belt. It is a reminder that in global capitalism, national boundaries are porous to money and resources, but they are hard walls for people. The capital can flow to Brazil, and the potash can flow to India, but you, the worker and the citizen, are stuck right where you are, dealing with the consequences of a game played far above your head. Now I want to take a moment to look at the machinery behind this because it is easy to get lost in the personalities. We focus on Carney and Trump because they are the faces on the screen, the avatars of these competing worldviews. But if you strip away the suits and the slogans, what you are really seeing is the collision of two completely different economic operating systems. On one side, represented by the Trump administration's approach, you have a chaotic, reactionary attempt to use the blunt instrument of the state tariffs, threats, borders to try and force the clock back to the 1,950 seconds. They want a world where the American economy is a fortress, but they are trying to build that fortress on a foundation of sand because they refuse to acknowledge how deeply integrated the global supply chain actually is. On the other side, represented by the strategy Carney is employing, you have the cold, calculated logic of modern financial capital. This is a system that does not care about borders. It cares about flows, and it cares about yield. And what the architects of this system realized long ago is that if you control the choke points, the pipelines, the shipping lanes, the mines, you control the economy. They spent the last 40 years consolidating that control. Think about it. How many companies do you think are involved in digging up this potash? It isn't hundreds, it's a handful. We have allowed the production of the most essential substance for human survival to be concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, all in the name of efficiency. They told us that mergers and acquisitions would lower costs. They told us that letting these giant conglomerates write their own rules would make the market more dynamic. Well, look around you. Is the market dynamic, or is it fragile? What we are witnessing now is the weaponization of that fragility. When you allow a monopoly to form, you are handing the owners of that monopoly a loaded gun. Usually, they point that gun at the consumer to extract higher prices. But in a geopolitical crisis, they can point it at a government. And that is what happened here. The efficiency they promised us turned out to be a trap. By eliminating redundancy, by maximizing just-in-time delivery, and by concentrating production in massive hubs like Saskatchewan, they created a system with zero slack. So when a political shock hits, like a tariff threat, there is no buffer. The shock travels instantly through the system, and it hits the weakest link first. And in our economy, the weakest link is always the person living paycheck to paycheck. You must ask yourself, Who permitted this scenario to materialize? It was not merely a single administration. This represents a bipartisan failure. For decades, Democrats and Republicans alike applauded the consolidation of agribusiness and deregulated the markets. They eviscerated the antitrust laws that were intended to prevent this specific type of leverage from existing. They signed the trade agreements that prioritized corporate rights over national resilience. They constructed the very trap that the country is now ensnared within. And now that the trap has snapped shut, they wish for you to believe it is the fault of a foreign adversary or a greedy neighbor. They do not want you to examine the structural design of the house. They merely want you to be angry at the person knocking on the door. Let's connect this to your daily life, because I know that potash market dynamics can sound abstract, but this is the mechanism that determines the price of your breakfast cereal. When the cost of fertilizer goes up because of these high-level games, the farmer doesn't just absorb that cost. He cannot. He has to pass it on to the grain elevator. The elevator passes it on to the processor passes it on to the retailer, and the retailer passes it on to you. But here's the trick. At every step of that chain, there is a little bit of extra profit being added. They call it margin maintenance. So a 10% increase in the cost of potash might become a 15 or 20% increase in the price of bread by the time it reaches your cart. This is what we call seller's inflation. They use the excuse of a supply shock to raise prices more than necessary, padding their profits while you struggle to balance your budget. This is why you should care about a trade dispute over a mineral you've never seen. It is a direct pipeline into your wallet, and what is most frustrating is that there is absolutely no democratic accountability in this process. Did you vote for the board of directors of the Potash Company? Did you vote for the strategy of diversifying exports to Brazil? Of course not. These decisions, which affect the basic affordability of life in this country, are made in private boardrooms behind closed doors by people whose only legal obligation is to their shareholders. Carney's brilliance here isn't that he found a way to feed more people or improve the soil. It's that he found a way to protect shareholder value against political interference. That is the definition of success in this system, and that is exactly the problem. We are seeing the limits of looking at economics through a purely national lens. The American worker and the Canadian worker have far more in common with each other than they do with the fertilizer executives in either country. Both are worried about the cost of living, and both are worried about job security. But this conflict is framed in a way that pits them against each other, hiding the class reality beneath a veneer of national competition. The reality is that capital has gone global, while politics has stayed local. And as long as that mismatch exists, figures like Carney will always run circles around figures like Trump because they are playing on a board that is much, much bigger than the one the politicians are looking at. They are moving pieces on a global map while Washington is still trying to build walls on a national one. We have to stop looking at these figures as heroes or villains in a comic book and start seeing them as functionaries of a system that has very specific rules. Mark Carney in this narrative is being hailed by the liberal establishment as a genius, a steady hand who knows how to navigate the stormy waters of international trade. He is presented as the antidote to the chaos of populism. But ask yourself, what exactly is he protecting? Is he protecting the wages of the Canadian miner? Is he protecting the affordable food supply for the North American family? No, he is protecting the stability of capital accumulation. He is ensuring that the flow of profit continues uninterrupted, even if that means redirecting the physical flow of resources away from his closest neighbor. This is the competence of the technocrat. It is the competence to keep the machine running for the benefit of its owners regardless of the human cost. When a factory closes in Ohio because a board of directors in Geneva or Toronto decided to shift production, that constitutes a violation of the social contract. The populist response is to vocally proclaim America first in an attempt to erect walls around the economy. Yet, as this potash situation demonstrates, one cannot construct a wall sufficiently high to exclude the laws of supply and demand. You cannot navigate your way out of a dependency via tariffs when you have spent 40 years creating that very dependency. The tragedy of the populist position lies in the fact that it correctly identifies the pain, the loss of sovereignty, and the economic insecurity, yet its solutions are essentially creating a circular firing squad. By instigating a conflict with a resource-rich neighbor without possessing a domestic backup plan, all they have managed to accomplish is to expose the country's jugular.